Hi, good morning everyone, thanks for coming. So I'll start by reading. This paper addresses questions of contemporary gender and feminist theory through an analysis of the figure of the little girl in La Rabia, a film by Albertina Carri, one of the leading young figures of what has been called New Argentine cinema. La Rabia is a horrific tale of family violence set in the Argentinian Pampas, focused through the eyes of Nati, a mute little girl who acts as a silent spectator as she watches her mother's submission to her authoritarian patriarchal father and witnesses her sadomasochistic sexual relations with another man. Nati unconsciously identifies with her mother, both in the domestic scene with the father and in the sexual act with a perverse lover, and mimics her through a set of autistic symptoms that echo the gendered violence inflicted on the maternal body. Nati expresses herself through three sets of symptoms. Firstly, letting out some primal, inarticulate animal yells. Secondly, taking her clothes off in public compulsively and spontaneously. And thirdly, drawing some terrified scribbles that take on a life of their own, which are represented in the film through watercolor, ink-based animation. In these three ways, Nati turns her helplessness, her disability, her speech and general linguistic impairment into a repetitive performance of gender violence. In clip number 1, for example, the father Poldo shouts at the mother, and Nati, in turn, compulsively starts yelling. No.
No sé qué mierda estás defendiendo ahora.
¿A mi hija le gusta ir?
La nena no va porque lo digo yo y se acabó. Ya pasó, Gaby.
In clip number 2, she witnesses a perverse sexual scene and reacts almost automatically and unconsciously by taking off her clothes. Propose that Nati, the figure of the mute girl, can help to rethink some of the key theoretical questions of feminist theory. Conceived also as a children's tale, according to what Carri herself has said in interviews, La Rabia, a Spanish word that refers both to the feeling of anger and to the virus, rabies, is a great metaphor for new ways of reading, conceiving, and theorizing gender. Reading the most recent work within gender and sexuality studies, I look at Nati as a way to conceptualize a subject that is not phallic, Oedipalized, structured by family logics, a subject outside patriarchal civilization. Firstly, Lisa Cartwright, who has developed a theory of affect and empathetic identification between the spectator and the child with sensory or cognitive impairment, has underscored how the coming to voice of the nonverbal female child marks the achievement of agency in a previously invisible or silent subject. In La Rabia, the mute female figure of the child enters the space of agency by coming to voice, an animal, primal, inarticulate voice by which she enacts a savage rebellion against the law of the symbolic, what Julia Kristeva has called the abject, a discharge, a convulsion, a crying out of repugnance and disgust, excluded from signification, and that challenges its master signifier. The yelling is a symptom within the body that turns the defenseless child into an inassimilable monster, an animal, a tumor, impossible to hear. After another scene of yelling in response to the perverted lover, which no one can stand, her mother says, "That noise hurts. Those noises are nasty." And later she says to her husband, "What do you expect people to say if she does not speak and shrieks like a pig? That is not normal." The mother's words underscore to what extent the yells of the little girl are breakages of social conventions and complete interruptions of communication. Secondly, the symptoms at the normal non-verbal level of the tactile, as Josiowicz has proposed, transmit a haptic experience through the texture of clothes, fabric, skin, and their physical properties, which is associated with affect, with desire as a social choice. In Nati's case, the physical act of undressing marks the limit of what can be said through texture, through clothes, touch, or bodily contact, a theatrical performance of violence, the unspeakable, the abused, the repressed. At these two sensory levels that represent the trauma of the little girl, sound and texture, the oral and the tactile, the spectator has mediated access to the experience of abuse inflicted on the female body. Instead of understanding her trauma intellectually, the spectator experiences the violence inflicted on the body of the child empathetically, through the oral and the tactile senses, turning himself or herself into a receptor of the sort of projector that the little girl is, empathizing with her, who in turn empathizes with her mother and the violence of gender that she is immersed in. However, it is through the third medium, the set of angry drawings, horrifying non-figurative paintings, that the little girl mainly challenges her nightmarely pornographic vision of the world. In clip 3, when Nati's father, in an attempt to threaten her, tells her a horror story about an angry uncle who was cheated on by his wife and returned as a ghost to chase and eat women that take off their clothes in public, the first watercolor animation appears.
El sueldo de la gente que trabajaba en educación. Ahí nomás, che, lo fueron a buscar. Y cuando lo encontraron, me cortaron la cabeza, lo degollaron como un chancho. Dicen que pataleaba. ¿Sabes dónde anda el tío de tu madre ahora? Suelto para el campo. Y se esconde en la estación esa que está ahí, cerquita de la Rabia. Porque nadie lo ve. Pero de repente sale, con la cabeza en la mano, siempre de smoking. Dicen que los casinos la gente se viste así. Parece que fueron a un entierro. Todo de negro. Él se le aparece a las chicas y a las nenas que se sacan la ropa y las tapa con una capa que tiene para que aprenda. Pero si lo vuelven a hacer, viene y se las come.
Her father's tale is intended to punish the cheating mother and in turn Nati's nakedness as a symptom of it. The drawings of the girl come into view through a language that forces the limits of filmic verisimilitude and breaks with realism and its cinematic conventions. Nati turns herself into an absolute projector, a viewer more than an agent, witness of the unspeakable, of her own passive exposure to violence, of her own bodily vulnerability. On the one hand, Gilles Deleuze, who has studied the figure of the post-war child in Italian neorealist film, has emphasized how the traumatized boy becomes a sleepwalker, a visionary, a helpless but unconventional witness of the crudeness and brutality of the world. Dream or nightmare, the vision of the child, of visual and sound nakedness, emerged through a new kind of image that Deleuze calls purely optical sound situation, in which the master signifier is absent. As in the case in the animation in La Rabia, the real becomes a spectacle, a drama of color, sound and texture, in which the child illustrator is inevitably included, underscoring her passive, defenseless exposure to the raw and most brutal gender violence and abuse. On the other hand, Judith Halberstam, in her most recent book, proposes what she calls the queer politics of failure. In her readings, she places the figure of the child both as spectator, audience of, and character in animated children's fiction, as vehicle for the transgression of gender boundaries and norms, a queering force, as Catherine von Stockton has said. For Halberstam, the child is a metaphor of the naive, the nonsensical, the silly, the ignorant, or the nonsensical. Beyond the Oedipal family, the child would open up a new set of knowledge practices and archives, of renovated alternatives for what we think of as queer. La Rabia's research into animation, as well as into new technologies of children's fantasy, may be conceptualized as a way of animating revolt, to paraphrase Halberstam. taking to a different formal and experimental level the topics that she reads in popular children's fiction. Therefore, if Chicken Run proposes a stateless all-female utopia in which the Oedipal family has fallen away as a point of reference, La Rabia offers a statement of collectivity, class and gender struggle in the absence of the master-father signifier. Additionally, in her most recent conferences and publication, feminist theory Julia Kristeva polemically points to the needs for thinking gender and sexuality studies through maternal eroticism, what she calls reliance. Kristeva, arguing for a renovated need to reflect on women's right to choose motherhood without excluding the most recent studies on biology and the new possibilities offered by science, puts forth a new theory of maternal sexuality. Maternal passion, according to Kristeva, is a two-sided Oedipus that combines death drive, negativity, unsatisfied desires, abjection, repulsion, and destructive violence with libidinal drives, the power of healing, subjective prostitution, and the hallucinatory intensity of pregnancy. Kristeva reconsiders infantile sexuality, and in particular the little girl's subjectivity, as formed together with maternal eroticism. This is particularly relevant in La Rabia because the mother and the little girl both inhabit an area of the biopsychic that defies rationality, of primal affection that challenges a model of masculine universal subjectivity. The little girl's act of scribbling those inarticulate animated drawings leads the mother back to the semiotic, the modality of sense before signification, what Kristeva calls the quora, a space before spatiality, nurturing and destructive at the same time, previous to the unified law of the father, to the word, the syllable. The drawings, the space of animation, where the violent drives of the little girl come to voice, constitute a becoming infantile of the mother, her becoming little girl, in the Lessian terms. The scribbles are a language of aesthetic and gender violence. They enact a breakage of all conventions through the most absolute objection. As a final point, I'm going to make reference to the new framework for feminist studies that the author Elizabeth Ross proposes in her most recent book, Becoming Undone. In a move beyond identity politics, the concern with questions of the subject and its identity, as well as beyond the epistemological questions of discourse, sign, truth, and knowledge, Ross argues towards a new ontology that would explore the impersonal, the inorganic, what predates and postdates the genesis of the individual. Consequently, she suggests that a new recourse to sexual difference and biology, without positing them in terms of subjective identity, but in a becoming imperceptible that would dissolve them into difference, would expand the activities, perspectives, and frameworks of feminist studies. This is pertinent because in La Rabia, the expressionistic crudeness and nakedness of the view of Nati manifests the little girl's relation with inorganic, pre-individual forces of imperceptibility that question a unified subject position through the inhuman, the subhuman and the superhuman, the animal, the natural, the spectre. Little Nati and her bodily symptoms illuminate a non-identitarian comprehension of biology and sexual difference. To conclude, this quick tour de force through recent feminist theory and film theory facilitates a wider consideration of the figure of the little girl as a signifier outside the unified subject of discourse, an enactment of radical perceptual difference that produces the undoing of all stabilities, as well as the failure of all identity, humbling the pretension of consciousness and mastery, dissolving identity into difference. Thanks very much.